Hey, I'm Jimmy, and this is Philosophy for Everyday Life. So I know it's been a while since I posted a video. This is mostly because during the fall months, I was busy wrapping up and defending my dissertation, and I also started a new romantic relationship, which perhaps I'll talk about sometime on this channel. I think romantic relationships are one aspect of everyday life, which have been neglected by philosophy, and there are a lot of ideas about relationships that I'd like to explore. I also want to get back to the idea of tactics in everyday philosophy, which I discussed in my first 3 videos. But first, I want to finish talking about the idea of the law of attraction. I think it's important to discuss this idea on this channel because the law of attraction is one popular contemporary attempt to develop a philosophy for everyday life. So in my last video, I discussed what seemed to me to be the important differences between Stoicism and the law of attraction. Stoicism tells us to diminish or weaken our desires for external things or for changed circumstances, and in this way to increase our inner freedom. Stoicism is also a materialist philosophy, and its instructions for living a good life seem to be based in part on its materialism, which is just the idea that matter is all that there is. Stoicism understands the world to be a place that operates according to inexorable material laws, which do not take our happiness or our virtue or our thoughts into account. There is no guarantee, according to Stoicism, that we will be as happy as we deserve to be. Indeed, the opposite is likely to be the case. The law of attraction, on the other hand, tells us to intensify our desires. It tells us that if we can imagine or think something, then we can realize it. And many of its advocates say something to the effect that if we desire or reflect on something intensely enough, forces outside our control will bring it to us. There is a passage in the novel The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho which perfectly expresses this idea. And when you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. Nothing could be further from Stoicism. The law of attraction, I said in my last video, presupposes that there is something more fundamental than matter, that what we think or feel has some power to determine reality. The best term I have for this perspective is idealism. In upcoming videos, I want to discuss some of the history of the idea of the law of attraction, to get a better sense of whether this idea has any plausibility, and to provide a bit more of a framework for thinking about it. Since most of its contemporary advocates are popular level writers, it can be difficult to define exactly what should be included in the idea of the law of attraction. But from what I can tell, most people agree that it has some connection to the 19th century New Thought movement. I'm going to rely on a contemporary of the early New Thought movement, the Harvard philosopher William James, to help us learn a bit more about it. I hope this will provide some illumination on the contemporary idea known as the law of attraction. William James, who lived from 1842 to 1910, was trained as a physician at Harvard, but never practiced medicine, turning instead to psychology and philosophy. He is considered the father of American psychology, was the first educator to offer a course in psychology in the United States, and with Charles Peirce and John Dewey, founded the school of philosophy known as Pragmatism. During his lifetime, James corresponded with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and at Harvard, he was the teacher of famous students such as future President Theodore Roosevelt. James also associated with American transcendentalist figures Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. William James's father, Henry James Sr., was an advocate of the writings of the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Henry James Sr. wrote his own works developing and defending the thought of Swedenborg. Swedenborg was influential for the pioneers of the New Thought movement, and I plan to make a subsequent video on his writings. For the moment, I simply want to point out that William James himself, who will be the primary topic of this video, was in some way influenced by Swedenborg through his father, Henry James Sr. In 1901 and 1902, William James delivered a series of lectures on religion, which were published in the form of a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. I want to focus in this video on 2 of the lectures, in which James discusses what he calls the religion of healthy-mindedness. For James, healthy-minded religion is basically any religious outlook which results in happiness, a sense of well-being, and a general affirmation of the goodness of life, including one's physical or bodily life. James views persons who adhere to the religion of healthy-mindedness as a psychological type. In other words, he thinks they are attracted to this religious outlook in part because they have a psychological predisposition to be so. Of this type, James writes that it involves a deliberate refusal to think ill of life, and a feeling that nature, if you will only trust her sufficiently, is absolutely good. He includes figures such as St. Francis of Assisi in this group, and writes the supreme contemporary example of such an inability to feel evil is, of course, Walt Whitman. James considered the contemporary New Thought movement to be an important example of the religious attitude of healthy-mindedness. He describes it as a movement which has recently poured over America and seems to be gathering force every day, and to which, for the sake of having a brief designation, I will give the title of the Mind Cure movement. There are various sects of this New Thought, to use another of the names by which it calls itself. But their agreements are so profound that their differences may be neglected for my present purpose, and I will treat the movement, without apology, as if it were a simple thing. It is a deliberately optimistic scheme of life, with both a speculative and a practical side. In its gradual development during the last quarter of a century, it has taken up into itself a number of contributory elements, and it must now be reckoned with as a genuine religious power. One of the doctrinal sources of the Mind Cure movement is the Four Gospels. Another is Emersonianism, or New England Transcendentalism. Another is Berkeleyan idealism. Another is Spiritism, with its messages of law and progress and development. Another, the optimistic popular science evolutionism, of which I have recently spoken. And finally, Hinduism has contributed a strain. But the most characteristic feature of the Mind Cure movement is an inspiration much more direct. The leaders in this faith have had an intuitive belief in the all-saving power of healthy-minded attitudes as such, in the conquering efficacy of courage, hope, and trust, and a correlative contempt for doubt, fear, worry, and all nervously precautionary states of mind. Their belief has in a general way been corroborated by the practical experience of their disciples, and this experience forms today a mass imposing in amount. I am especially interested in the range of influences that James notes here, not only the American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, but also the Scottish philosopher George Berkeley, not only the Gospels in the New Testament, but also Hinduism. In future videos, I'll explore some of these additional streams which flowed into the movement known as New Thought, and from there into much contemporary self-help literature. For the moment, I want to focus on James's claim that the New Thought movement is, in his words, decidedly pantheistic. Pantheism is the idea that God and the universe are one. Philosophically, perhaps the most important advocate of pantheism was Baruch Spinoza. James writes of the type of pantheism advocated by New Thought. The spiritual in man appears in the Mind Cure philosophy as partly conscious, but chiefly subconscious, and through the subconscious part of it, we are already one with the divine, without any miracle of grace or abrupt creation of a new inner man. As this view is variously expressed by different writers, we find in it traces of Christian mysticism, of transcendental idealism, of Vedantism, and of the modern psychology of the subliminal self. A quotation or two will put us at the central point of view. As an illustration, James goes on to quote from the New Thought author R.W. Trine. Trine writes, "The great central fact of the universe is that spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all, that manifests itself in and through all. This spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all is what I call God. I care not what term you may use, be it kindly light, providence, the oversoul, omnipotence, or whatever term may be most convenient, so long as we are agreed in regard to the great central fact itself. God then fills the universe alone, so that all is from him and in him, and there is nothing that is outside. He is the life of our life, our very life itself. We are partakers of the life of God, and though we differ from him in that we are individualized spirits, while he is the infinite spirit, including us, as well as all else beside, Yet in the essence of the life of God and the life of man are identically the same. Yet in essence, the life of God and the life of man are identically the same, and so are one. They differ not in essence or quality, they differ in degree. James also observed the connection between New Thought and what is today often called the light of attraction. He writes, "Most mind-curers bring in a doctrine that thoughts are forces, and that by virtue of a law that like attracts like, one man's thoughts draw to themselves as allies all the thoughts of the same character that exist the world over. Thus, one gets by one's thinking reinforcements from elsewhere for the realization of one's desires. And a great point in the conduct of life is to get the heavenly forces on one's side by opening one's own mind to their influx." Now, depending on your predilections, you may find this way of thinking that James is describing either extremely appealing or entirely absurd. I have to admit I find a mixture of both reactions in myself. That's one of the reasons I'm interested in exploring the idea further. I'm not quite ready to offer my own evaluation, but I'd like to end this video by noting that James himself refused to condemn the New Thought movement, even though he was certainly aware of some of its excesses. He considered the Christian Science movement of Mary Baker Eddy to be the most extreme and most obviously misguided version of the New Thought movement. But he did not write off its ideas altogether. Instead, he compared them to earlier versions of Christian religious experience, which his audience would have considered acceptable. He describes the prescription of New Thought as a type of spiritual letting go, an idea which may be familiar to some of you through 12-step slogans such as "Let Go" and "Let God." James writes of this idea in the New Thought movement, "Give up the feeling of responsibility. Let go your hold. Resign the care of your destiny to higher powers. Be genuinely indifferent as to what becomes of it all. And you will find not only that you gain a perfect inward relief, but often also, in addition, the particular goods you sincerely thought you were renouncing. This is the salvation through self-despair, the dying to be truly born of Lutheran theology, the passage into nothing of which Jacob Behmen writes. To get to it, a critical point must usually be passed, a corner turned within one. Something must give way, a native hardness must break down and liquefy. And this event, as we shall abundantly see hereafter, is frequently sudden and automatic, and leaves on the subject an impression that he has been wrought on by an external power. The mind-curers have given the widest scope to this sort of experience. They have demonstrated that a form of regeneration, by relaxing, by letting go, psychologically indistinguishable from the Lutheran justification by faith and the Wesleyan acceptance of free grace, is within the reach of persons who have no conviction of sin and care nothing for Lutheran theology. It is but giving your little private convulsive self a rest, and finding that a greater self is there. The results, slow or sudden, or great or small, of the combined optimism and expectancy, the regenerative phenomena which ensue on the abandonment of effort, remain firm facts of human nature, no matter whether we adopt a theistic, a pantheistic idealistic, or a medical materialistic view of their ultimate causal explanation. In this passage, we see James's theory of pragmatism at work. He is not really concerned with the truth of the metaphysical system of the New Thought movement, but with whether its practice of mind cure actually produces positive results. James thinks that the answer to that question, putting aside the metaphysical substructure, is a strong affirmative. He offers in a footnote, however, 3 ways of thinking about the underlying metaphysics of mind cure practices. He writes, "The theistic explanation is by divine grace, which creates a new nature within one the moment the old nature is sincerely given up. The pantheistic explanation, which is that of most mind curers, is by the merging of the narrower private self into the wider or greater self, the spirit of the universe, which is your own subconscious self, the moment the isolating barriers of mistrust and anxiety are removed. The medico-materialistic explanation is that simpler cerebral processes act more freely, where they are left to act automatically by the shunting out of physiologically, though in this instance not spiritually, higher ones, which seeking to regulate only succeed in inhibiting results. whether this third explanation might, in a psychophysical account of the universe, be combined with either of the others may be left an open question here. So James is saying that there might be a theistic explanation of the mind cure practices of the New Thought movement, or a pantheistic explanation, which is what practitioners of the movement generally adhere to, or sort of a medical explanation, something like the placebo effect. And he leaves open which of these might be the true explanation. Though I can appreciate James's desire to ask about the pragmatic effects of mind cure practices, I'm not sure that these three possible explanations work equally well for mind cure practices. I wonder whether, for practitioners, mind cure could actually be effective without some type of pantheistic explanation. It seems that the theistic or medico-materialistic explanations would undermine one's ability really to believe in the effectiveness of mind cure practices, and would therefore undermine their pragmatic use as well. But I'll leave a full discussion of that question for another day.